and unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. This morning, I would like to contemplate with you some more the Bodhisattva way, the Bodhisattva heart. I spent quite a bit of time on Dogen's fascicle, Hotsu Bodaishin, which could be translated arousing bodhicitta. It doesn't fully translate it because I'm using Sanskrit. I'm going from Japanese to some English, some Sanskrit. I did that deliberately because the word bodhicitta is of supreme importance in the Mahayana, the mind or heart of awakening. And a quick review that's what it literally means, but the concept of awakening needs to be unpacked. It's His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls it the altruistic aspiration for enlightenment. So it's the aspiration to awaken not for oneself, but to be of benefit to beings. So that's an essential aspect of the definition of bodhicitta, which isn't obvious from a literal translation of the verbiage. And so in Dogen's fascicle, he begins by talking about the three minds, discerning mind, discerning consciousness, we sometimes call discursive consciousness, the thinking mind, in other words, grass and trees consciousness, which is the subtlemost level of mind before duality, before the split into subject-object, a more primal or primordial aspect of awareness that we're often not very hip to, aware of, but it's always there. If we're involved in other things, it's still there. It's just not salient in our experience. And lastly, he talks about assembling consciousness, which I conjecture is Alaya Vijnana, the repository of all karma, which influences how we perceive the world, how we behave, especially if we are on autopilot all the time. But I don't want to go into all three of those minds. I want to go forward from an assertion that Dogen makes early on in the fascicle, where he says that it's discerning mind, it's thinking mind, it's discursive mind that is used to arouse bodhicitta. A lot of times in Zen practice in particular, Buddhist practice in general, Zen practice in particular, the thinking mind gets a lot of bad rap, a lot of disrespect. But Dogen makes this assertion that it's thinking mind that is actually used to arouse bodhicitta. Then he says, it's not that thinking mind is itself bodhicitta, but that thinking mind is used to arouse bodhicitta. And so one thing I want to hold in mind as we look at this issue of using the thinking mind for practice is that thinking is always happening on some level, gross or subtle, and thinking can, two general categories of thinking that I want to propose to think about is habitual thinking and volitional thinking. Habitual thinking is just the stuff that is spontaneously churning in your head, in my head, in our heads, as we go through our day and we receive various inputs, sensory inputs, experiential inputs that trigger thinking, automatically, habitually bubbling up from the alive jnana, the storehouse consciousness, our conditioned thought that is triggered spontaneously and just kicks in. Then there's volitional thinking, like remember in school, if you were given a math problem that was a word problem, like Joe the bus driver went 30 miles east, then he, et cetera, then you choose to apply your thought to try to figure out, reframe that into a mathematical equation, perhaps, to solve the problem, where you're actually willfully, volitionally setting your thinking mind to a task. So those are crude categories, reducing all thinking to two, but for our purposes, let's consider that there's two categories of thought. Habitual thought and volitional thought. And each morning, when we chant all my ancient twisted karma from beginning this greed-hated illusion, we're basically acknowledging that we have a conditioned way of thinking, and hence a conditioned way of perceiving what we take to be reality. Not necessarily reality, but we have a habitual reality that when we're on autopilot, when we allow conditioning to run the show, then it puts in front of us a world which we take to be the world, and we live in that world when we're on habitual thinking in autopilot. And so each morning we confess all my ancient twisted karma, that we have this program that untended tends to run automatically and run the show. And then there's volitional thinking. Now, obviously, I would think, when Dogen says that it's thinking mind that is used to arouse bodhicitta, he's not talking about habitual thinking. He's talking about making a choice in how we think. So I'd like to ask you to contemplate those two types of thinking, and kind of like, sometimes I have an athletic watch that I never use anymore because I'm not doing athletic things lately, but it would track steps, and so you could set it to track steps, and it'll tell you how many steps you've taken. I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have a tracker for like mantra recitation? Like, that each time you recite the mantra, it would track it, so you could look at the, midday, you could see, well, I've done 700 recitations or whatever. And so one thing I'd like to propose is that we track our thinking and monitor how much time do we just let the program run, and how much time do we actually use applied thought to imagine and choose the world in which we enter and live. Because that's what Dogen is pointing at, is we can use thinking mind to arouse enlightened reality, bodhicitta. Now, thinking is not enlightened reality, but thinking can actually propel us into a more enlightened reality when we choose how we think, and we choose thoughts that actually are conducive to awakening. So initially, I just want to propose that for you, that we think about thought. There's two categories of thought, habitual and volitional, and that volitional thought is used, and that habitual thought we have a very elaborate program at the ready that will just plug in automatically unless we choose volitional mental activity rather than habitual mental activity. And so to monitor, how we're using, monitor what's going on in our heads, monitor whether we're in autopilot or if we're activating a certain volitional activity of thought that we've chosen for ourselves, and and see how much is on autopilot and how much is by choice. And the one observation I'd like to point out is that sometimes the volitional programs might have a boring aspect to them in comparison to the melodrama of habitual thought we were running, like a practice of mind training, where you're saying, when I was a student at Tassajara and I was in the dining room, I had the practice of refilling the guests' water glasses during guest season, and may the person drinking this water be happy, contented, and free from suffering. Compared to whatever kind of scenario I was running in my head beforehand, that was, oh God, it could be it could have the aspect of not very interesting. But if you persevere in the practice, a world is opened up. The world you're in is transformed, and these precious beings, these adorable beings, are inhabiting it, rather than whatever other scenario was habitually springing up to mind. So anyway, that's been my experience, is that initially when you choose some kind of volitional mind training, which we're going to get into a little bit today, I think, it may not be as interesting as your melodrama, what Ram Dass would call your melodrama, the habitual stories you tell about the good guys and the bad guys and all the other stuff, and how fate has been cruel to you, or whatever other story, how wonderful you are to people, whatever kind of stories you tend to tell during your experience can be very interesting compared to, may this person who drinks this water know happiness and contentment, to be free from suffering. That's not as juicy on the surface, but it opens up a richer world if you persevere. So, Dogen says it's thinking mind, discerning mind, discursive mind, the mind of verbiage and thoughts, that arouses bodhicitta, or the heart of awakening. And this has been the case in the history of Buddhism, that traditions of cultivating compassion have been developed using thinking. The earliest example that I would like to briefly review is in the Indo-Tibetan school. There's two in the earliest source materials: the sevenfold cause and effect method of cultivating bodhicitta, and the exceptional method of exchanging self and other, equalizing and exchanging self and other. In brief, the sevenfold method involves imagining all beings as having been at one time your mother, in countless rebirths. At one time, that person who's a real pain in the derriere right now was an adoring mother who actually was a good mother. Maybe other incarnations not so good, but at one time it was a good mother who took good care of you lovingly, affectionately. And you reflect that through the countless cycles of rebirth, each and every being has been that kind of a mother for you in your incarnation. And so you start to regard beings as kind, loving mothers. And you generate gratitude, and you generate a desire to repay their kindness. and you generate a will to repay their kindness, etc. In the 7 various points, developing that initial thought of imagining all beings as your mother. So that's thinking, right? You're using a certain narrative of things, of reality or an imagined reality, and you're putting yourself inside of that narrative and trying to perceive the constituents of your moment by moment life within the context of that narrative. That's using thinking mind to create a new kind of reality. The exceptional method of equalizing and exchanging self and other is to reflect, I want to be happy. I don't want to suffer. You know, hey, everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to be suffer. We're the same, you know. We're all beings basically, regardless of their confused method of pursuing happiness, are trying to, you know, want happiness and don't want to suffer. And we are alike in that. We are equal in that. Since we are equal in that, it would be unjust of me to prioritize my own happiness above the countless others who are just the same and have the same aspirations and the same wish. Therefore, I will exchange my self-cherishing for cherishing all of others. So once again, you're using thought, you know, like Dogen says, it's discerning mind that generates the heart of enlightenment, bodhicitta. And so you're using thought, perhaps a thought, you know, the earlier thought of regarding all beings as your mother requires either a belief in or imaginative employment of this notion of rebirth, which in 21st century United States might be a bit of a stretch. And equalizing and exchanging self and others is much more accessible because just, you know, we all have the same desire for safety, comfort, contentment, pleasure, and the same aversion to pain and anguish and suffering. You know, and so it's quite easy to see that we are all the same in that, and we can connect with a shared sense of humanity, which doesn't stress reason quite so much, perhaps, as the other method. And it just so happens, you know, that Tsongkhapa and others did expound upon the sevenfold cause and effect. The bulk of the literature about cultivating bodhicitta relies upon the equalizing and exchange of self and other. You know, that's the bulk of the literature. Dogen, in his fascicle, talks about the ferryman, leading others across before yourself, which is a metaphorical expression of equalizing and exchanging self and other. You know, and that's that's an ancient metaphor in the tradition for the nobility of that aspiration of, you know, leading others across to liberation before yourself, because you're prioritizing others over yourself. So discerning mind is used to awaken the part of the bodhisattva. And it's volitional discerning mind. It's making choices about how you choose to view and process the spontaneously occurring experiences in your life. Making use of everything to strengthen one's aspiration, one's deeper aspiration. And the Lojong tradition in Tibetan Buddhism is especially the 7-point mind training, of which there are 59 slogans. The Lojong tradition uses this notion of taking all aspects of life, including and especially difficult circumstance. When the world is filled with misery, take all obstacles as the path to awakening is one of the slogans. And so once again, I think it's good to have a practice of recognizing thinking. It's going on practically all the time. You know, sometimes it's more rapid than others. You know, in Zazen, it slows down considerably, you know, and it may actually, flip for a moment, not exactly stop, but flip. A bit quick digression to explain what I mean by that. You know, Dogen talks about when you hear sounds and see forms fully engaging body and mind, you grasp things directly. Unlike an object reflected in a mirror, and unlike the moon reflected in the water, when one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. And this is related to what he says in Genjo Koan, where he says, to carry yourself forward and experience myriad things is delusion, that myriad things come forth and experience themselves, or the self is awakening. So you're sitting in Zazen and, you know, thinking is happening. Then all of a sudden there's just the sound of the geese, like there was this morning. That's a kind of thought, but it's a flipped thought. You know, when one side is illuminated, the other side is dark. Well, you know, so you're no longer carrying yourself forward with a subject approaching the geese. You come into being with the geese. So sometimes thinking can flip into that's called hishiryo in Japanese, real thinking, where it's just the geese. But so some kind of conscious activity is always going on in digression. And so to study, to take an interest in, you know, is it, are you running reel number 7? Back in the day when there was like audio tape reels, or, you know, or program number 13 in your MPG files? Or are you volitionally thinking fresh and new, you know, and generating willfully, with freedom of expression, the thinking that's occurring? Very, very, very good to, you know, to study, and to study objectively. You know, don't, without the preconceived notion that habitual thinking is bad and volitional thinking is good, because, you know, that's not the case. You know, habit is necessary to function. You know, we need to have programs available to safely navigate the circumstances of life. But to take responsibility for thinking. Yeah, you know, you know, you're running a program. You know, it has effects. So, you know, take responsibility. And, you know, one step is to recognize what kind of thinking is going on. If it's habitual thinking, it might be okay, you know, but it won't generate awakening. It's because it's playing a program. It's not fresh and new. Awakening is always fresh and new. And it might be a useful program to remember what to do when the light turns yellow. That's a good program to be able to run, but it won't generate awakening. And so, you know, what kind of program you're running, and to have the intrepid spirit to create programs, to create ways of thinking, to transform your experience of your life to where it's more consonant with the deepest nature of things. It's got some imagination and some creativity to it that open new modalities of perceiving things. That's possible. It's possible to actually, what is it? Aldous Huxley talked about opening the doors of perception. I think he was talking about psychotropics mainly, but no, this is thinking. You can do similar things, more reliable things, and more wholesome things simply by choosing how to think. So for the remainder of this morning, I want to present a slogan from the 7-point mind training. Actually, not a slogan, but one of the points. Introduce a point and talk about that point a little bit. And the point is, I believe it's point number 5, make practice your whole life. Make practice your whole life. So a little preamble to this is, sometimes practices can be viewed as an addendum or a new thing I'm doing, or I've got my to-do list, I've got my interests, and I'm going to add meditation as another thing. And that's ill-conceived. That doesn't touch the nature of what practice is. Practice is not some particular activity. Practice is how we live in all of the particulars of living. And that's not always understood. And Norman Fisher talks about, he sometimes goes and he gives presentations at places like Google, because he lives close to Silicon Valley, and in other venues like that, and you'll hear people say, I'm just so busy, I don't have time to practice, I don't have time to do meditation. And his response, one of the responses that he says he gives is, well, I don't have time not to. If I don't practice, I find that I end up dropping things, and I have to go back and pick up the things that I've dropped. He meant that metaphorically, that on a psychological, mental, emotional level, practice creates a certain lubrication to how we go through life. That if we're kind of like engaging things volitionally, we make fewer mistakes of heart and mind that we have to go back and say, oh, hey, I'm sorry I said that thing to you, but I wasn't practicing. Something like that. And so practice doesn't take any time whatsoever. It's your life, and it's not, and so if you're alive, you're practicing, but how are you practicing? What kind of practice are you doing? What kind of program are you playing? So that's one thing to consider when looking at the slogan, make practice your whole life. In a sense, it already is, but you could be practicing frustration, getting really good at getting frustrated. You could be practicing dejection and getting really good at being dejected. But because you're playing tape number 7 or tape number 3, instead of creating a tape that has new options to it. So make practice your whole life. It can sound daunting, like no breaks. Well, but rest is a kind of practice as well, and sometimes the appropriate practice. So I want to share with you some of the things that Norman says about this point in his book, Training in Compassion, the Zen practice of Lojong. And he says, so at the very beginning of chapter 5, which is what makes me assume that make practice your whole life is point number 5, but I could have that wrong. He says, We take our point of view so much for granted, as if the world were really as we see it. In another book, The World Could Be Otherwise, he talks about attitudes, and that we all have an attitude of some kind or another, and we see the world through an attitude. It's inevitable. We may not be aware of it, like a fish doesn't think it's wet because it's in water all the time. We may not cognize the fact that we're seeing the world through an attitude, but we always have some kind of attitude which determines the world we see. We take our point of view so much for granted, as if the world were really as we see it. But it doesn't take much analysis to recognize that our way of seeing the world is simply an old, unexamined habit. So strong, habit. Let's say that word again, habit. Not the kind of discerning mind that leads to awakening, but the kind of discerning mind that keeps things as they are, or makes them worse, maybe. But it doesn't take much analysis to recognize that our way of seeing the world is simply an old, unexamined habit, so strong, so convincing, and so unconscious we don't even see it as a habit. How many times have we been absolutely sure about someone's motivations and later discovered that we were completely wrong? How many times have we gotten upset about something that turned out to have been nothing? Our perceptions and opinions are often quite off the mark. The world may